physics in 7th grade and biology in 8th grade. New York State. They should have had understand what you talk to
Good evening and welcome to the Cary Institute Friday Night at Cary Lecture Series. For the new faces in the crowd tonight, my name is Larry Weaner and I'm the Director of Communications here at Cary. We are an independent, not-for-profit environmental research organization. We have a team of 15 PhD-level scientists and many researchers and educators all working together to advance things like understanding the ecology of Lyme disease or how climate change is impacting the Hudson River. It's a broad program and an exciting program. Special thanks goes out to the Aldo Leopold faces in the crowd tonight. I see a number of them. Your support makes these programs possible, and if anyone's interested in learning more about the Aldo Leopold Society, we have some literature on the table outside. Tonight, we are really thrilled to have Larry Weaner presenting. He came to me as a recommendation from Doug Talley. It's no secret that the Cary Institute is a fan of native plants, and Doug Talley did a wonderful lecture here on bringing nature home and transforming yards into sanctuaries for native plants and animals, for the folks and bees and birds. Folks loved that lecture, and I had asked Doug to recommend someone who could really speak to the whole putting a landscape in place at multiple scales, and Larry was at the top of his list, so that was a great thing that he could come and be with us. A little bit about Larry, if you're not familiar with his work, many of you I think are. He works with native meadows, and his designs are just amazing. He's a visionary of what's called self-proliferating landscapes, and these combine ecological processes and native species and plant characteristics to create enduring landscapes. He works across a variety of scales, so there's the backyards, and then there's the acre public installation. And he's been at this for more than 30 years and combines principles of horticulture, environmental science, and traditional garden design. His firm, Larry Weaner Landscape Associates, has projects throughout the Northeast and collaborations in places like California and Colorado. And their work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, American Gardener, Garden Design, all these wonderful places. And I'm just thrilled to have Larry here this evening. I look forward to personally hearing a little bit more about how native plants can be used to displace the invasives that many of us struggle with. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to him. At the end of the lecture, he's agreed to do a brief Q&A, so we'll do more then as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lori. Can you all hear me okay? Good, good. I've never had one of these ear mic things before. It's a big day for my ear. I got a bee sting on my ear, and now I got a mic thing. I want your help. But I'm glad to be here and have a little bit of history with this organization. It's a fine organization. I love the work they've been doing for quite a long time. But I've taught courses here. I haven't for a while, but a number of years back. And then kind of a funny story, we scheduled a class that I was going to teach here on Meadows a number of months in advance, and I put it on my calendar. And then time went by, and I looked at my calendar to see what was coming up, and realized I'd scheduled that class on the night of my daughter's bat mitzvah. So I called my wife and said I wasn't going to be able to make it to the bat mitzvah. She didn't understand, so I had to schedule that class. Anyway, I'm going to jump right into my talk. If we could get the lights down quite a bit, I'd appreciate it. Because I got a lot to cover. I'm not here to just show some pretty pictures of meadows and plants. I'm here to talk about a fundamentally different way of designing, planting, and managing landscapes. And as you can see, setting a process in motion, assisted plant proliferation in the design landscape. So what is that about? Pretty much anywhere, if you do nothing, stuff grows. I don't think I'm telling you, so that's my lecture, I'm done, thank you very much. I don't think I'm telling you anything you didn't know, and some of what grows may be fun and good stuff that you'd like to see, and others are not. And probably more of it's not what you wanted than you did. But so let's talk about this idea that things grow on their own, and how can we incorporate that into what we do in a garden. Here's an example. This is a path through a meadow that we planted not that far from here in Salisbury, Connecticut. And you're looking at a really beautiful elderberry shrub growing out of the base of the wall. Now what's going on here is there's a meadow off to the right, which you're only seeing a little piece of. There's a mowed path along the wall, and that's pretty much it. However, periodically, I ask the lawn folks, the people that mow the lawn, to not mow a little strip right on the edge. And you can see it's a little scruffy there of the wall. And why am I doing that? Let it grow for a while. Really, you know, the aesthetics here is we want clean lawn to the wall, not a scruffy patch along the edge. So why am I doing that? The reason I'm doing that is I'm letting the seed bank express itself a little bit. Search for things that may be desirable. When I find them, such as an elderberry shrub, I'm marking it off. And then I say, okay, go back to mowing against the wall, except go around where I flagged. And it results in things like this elderberry. Why is that elderberry there? Because someone was looking for allowing things to grow, looking for the desirable, and then going back to mowing around it and saving that. So, you know, that's not that complicated, and it's not that hard to do. So here's a question. When I'm standing looking at a landscape, whether it's something I want to manage or I'm going to plant eventually, or the first question I ask is, where is it headed if I do nothing? And the next question is, what aspects of that do I consider desirable, and what aspects of that do I consider undesirable? And the next question is, what techniques can I perform to manage that landscape to steer it towards the desirable? Now, that may sound kind of fuzzy and not very precise, and what the heck do I really do with that? That's what we're going to talk about today. So here's an example. This is a field that I had nothing to do with, and I just drove by it on the way to see a new project. This is in the coastal plain in Maryland. And I looked out my window as I'm driving by, and it looked like pretty nice vegetative composition, so to speak. So I got out and I walked around and looked at it. And it was. And there's broom sedge, and I'm not going to show you every plant that's in there that's desirable, but it was a pretty nice composition of herbaceous and woody plants, kind of an early stage old field, where the herbaceous stage is moving to the woody, and there's oak trees, and there's red cedars, and there's broom sedge, and red twig dogwood, and lots of other cool stuff. However, the reason I'm showing you this is because as I'm walking in the field, I see that there is someone, and that's a good thing, is paying attention to this field and valuing it clearly because they're planting trees. And you can see a tree tube there, and in the tree tube you can see a little piece of a sweet gum sticking out. And next to the tree tube you see twice as big sweet gum that nobody planted. It was probably there, small and buried in the grass, and not seen when they planted the sweet gum. So let's go back to this landscape and ask the question that I had just put forth a few moments ago. If I do nothing, where is it headed? Well, if you understand the vegetative progression in the coastal plain, you will know that in most cases, in a wettish meadow particularly, which this is, sweet gums will come in by the thousands, and sometimes they'll be inches apart. And that is very, very common, if not usual, in that kind of a habitat, in that kind of in that part of the country. So if I'm standing in this field and thinking about what can I do to make this place better, to help it, and think, well, where's it going if I do nothing? You can pretty well say there's going to be a lot of sweet gums. And sweet gum isn't necessarily something that I am best putting my resources into. Now, as I walked around the field, the vast majority of the vegetation was nice native stuff. But occasionally you'd find an autumn olive or a multiflora rose. So if I was standing and saying again, where is this headed? I would say, I'm probably going to get a lot of sweet gums. If I want diversity of trees, maybe I should plant something that I would not expect to commonly occur. Or maybe I should put my resources into getting rid of those few multiflora roses and autumn olives. Because where is it headed? I'm going to get a lot of sweet gums. I'm also going to get an expansion of those invasive species. And what's an easy job today, because there's not many of them, might be a horrendous, almost impossible job in 5 or 7 or 10 years when they've been allowed to spread like wildfire through the landscape. However, not all landscapes are on a great trajectory, such as this field full of mugwort. So, where's this headed? Mugwort and more mugwort. So I'm going to have to be pretty active here. So here's what we're talking about. Plan for and implement strategies that favor the natural recruitment and proliferation of desired over undesired species, and integrate that program with an arranged planting plan. So in traditional garden design, You make a list of the plants that you want, and you arrange them, and you plant them in that arrangement, and you pretty much weed everything in between. And your hope is that each plant gets big and gets to its full size, and you hold back everything else, and continue to hold back everything else over time. However, in nature, pretty much anywhere you go, if you walk in the woods and take a spot, walk in a field, walk in a wetland, and catalog, inventory the vegetation that's there, and come back in 10 years, it won't be the same. Some things have dropped out, and some things have come in, and some things are still there. And that's the way nature almost always works. And by definition, to plant a static composition of plants and hold it there indefinitely is kind of fighting with natural processes. Now, by the same token, we can't just let things happen. We could easily end up with a field of mugwort. We have to manage it. But manage the desirable aspects of what are happening, add in the things that are not likely to happen on their own that we want, and hold back what we don't. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So there's different levels that you can practice this. Horticulture, kind of illustrated with lines. Traditional horticulture, I'm going to call a straight line. It's a static arrangement. It's a line. We're going to put every plant that we want in here, and that's the end of it. And anything that comes in outside of that specified plant palette is going to be considered a weed. Here we have what I call higher design restoration. So now we have two lines. We have the line on the left and the line on the right. And we're saying that anything within those parameters is acceptable, and anything without those parameters are not acceptable. What do I mean by that? Well, let's give you an example. If little blue stem comes in, which is a beautiful grass that we have in the meadow out front here, I would let that happen, because it's a nice, beautiful, short plant that wouldn't conflict with a design that I'm likely doing, even if it was close to the house and intended to be fairly demure, so to speak. But a Canada goldenrod, which is a very aggressive native species, not necessarily something that's on an invasive plant list, but it's aggressive and it's rank and it's big, would fall out of that parameter. And so I would not consider that acceptable. Now I've got a wilder restoration. I've just got a wider acceptance of what kind of plants I'm going to allow. And probably Canada goldenrod is still outside of it, because that's a pretty aggressive plant. Now I have what I'll call anything not invasive. This is a 10-acre field that you don't have the money or the time to deal with, and you just want to keep it in a reasonable state, but you're not trying for rare, beautiful plants and great diversity. You just don't want it to be a jungle of invasives. There, you might say, fine, Canada goldenrod is okay. It's a native plant, it's got a yellow flower, it has wildlife value. Yes, it's too aggressive in general, but I'm just going to let it be, because I don't have the resources or the inclination to try to make it into a better composition. And here's just examples of it. Horticulture, and this isn't a value judgment on this, it's arranged, and that's pretty much what is intended to happen down the road. High design restoration, the golden groundsel, which you see, the yellow flower, is a rhizomatous, or excuse me, a stoloniferous species that's going to spread as an understory through all these other plants. There's seeding around. The reddish plant that you see is a little, could we get these lights over here down a little bit or something off? I think the screen is still pretty light. That reddish, thank you. The reddish leafed plant, those are coral bells, but there's penstemon that's been planted that's seeding itself around, but it's still very arranged. There's a backbone of shrubs that have been planted and arranged. So there's things moving around on their own, but it's still very designed like a garden. Moving into wilder restoration. The ferns were not planted, they were just managed to expand. The Amsonia with the blue flower was planted. The mountain laurel in the background was transplanted from elsewhere on the property. The hawthorns in the background were planted. So now we're talking about wider parameters of so to speak, design evidence. And then anything not invasive. Here you have goldenrod and snakeroot, Eupatorium rugosum, two plants that show up almost anywhere, native plants. Is this high design and something that is going to be in Garden Design magazine? Probably not, but it's a desirable composition, and we're just not looking to have to work any more than we have to, other than keeping out the real problem plants. So plants moving around in the garden is certainly not unheard of in traditional horticultural practice. However, it is generally rare and happenstance. Here, the self-propagation of planted and naturally recruited species is a significant component of the landscape's development and is intentionally incorporated into all aspects of planning, planting, and management. So let's talk a little bit about how we do that. So first of all, selecting and placing plants. In ecological terms, if you're an ecologist and a plant is planted in the landscape, or a plant is in the landscape and naturally recruited, you define it as being successful not because that individual lived. That plant is successful in the landscape if it has propagated and expanded or colonized elsewhere into the landscape. And in a garden, that's not what we're usually looking for. We just want the plant to live. Now, how do you get plants that are going to self-propagate and move out into the landscape and help colonize? Well, one way is for it to be in the habitat with which it is normally associated, meaning it's going to be more likely to not just live, but thrive and produce a lot of viable seed. So here we have a landscape, and I use this not because I wanted to show you this remnant lime kiln, but because it sets it in a place that has an ecological ramification. This is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is soils derived from limestone, which tend to be high pH and host and serve as a habitat for certain species of plants. And interestingly, they're called calcareous soils derived from limestone, higher pH, and they occur less commonly than acidic soils in the northeast of New England, but there are veins of limestone that occur in different places around here. So if you're there, you want to know that, and you want to use the plants that are associated with that type of habitat so they thrive and proliferate, not just live. Just because you can keep it alive in a garden doesn't mean that it's serving the function you want it to function in this kind of more dynamic landscape. So you see some plants like Chrysogonum, green and gold, the common garden plant. You see Jacob's ladder on the right. You see Canada anemone. These are all plants that are associated with calcareous, limestone-derived soils. Another plant like that is maidenhair fern. Everybody loves maidenhair fern. It's a really beautiful plant. Everybody would love to grow it in their garden, pretty much, if you got a shady woodland garden. And it's known to be finicky, hard plant to grow. It just doesn't do well. Well, it doesn't do well because it's associated with this kind of soil. And if you have it, forget it. Throw it out there and it's fine. If you don't, it's always going to struggle. And you can keep it alive, yes, but is it going to really proliferate in the landscape? Probably not. So the first thing is to use the plants that are adapted to the habitat in which you are working. Another situation where you have blue, I'm not sure why. Oh, so spacing and selecting plants. I moved on to the next category. I got a little confused myself a little bit. So now we're talking about selecting plants for their characteristics of proliferation. Now, plants proliferate from seed. They proliferate from rhizomes, which are expanding underground roots, from stolons, which are stems that expand above ground and then root in as they're traveling. These are all different methods that you should be cognizant of when you're planting a plant and trying to use. The idea is to incorporate in your plant list each strategy that there is. In other words, you're throwing the book at this landscape. There are plants that move all different kinds of ways, and the chances are something's going to find spots and gaps and fill them, or expand into the landscape that you have yet to plant, but that you're hoping to have colonized. And then within the seed part of it, there are different seed dispersal strategies. So let's look at Geranium maculatum, which is the pink plant in the lower center there. Geranium maculatum disperses seeds by gravity, meaning it just falls at the base of the plant. So if I wanted to colonize a garden the size of this room, which is really small meadow, but it's a really big garden, and a lot of this is about scale. We talk a lot about, oh, let's change our lawns to something else, and let's get out in the woods and not just let the invasives go or just mow it all. Let's try to manage it into more native species. All of these, even if they're a small patch of woods or a little piece of lawn, they're bigger than garden scale. And horticulturists have gotten away with planting and weeding everything in between it for many, many years and created wonderful gardens along the way, and I'm not criticizing them. But once you're getting out there and saying, I'm going to change my lawn to something else, now it's a different scale. Now you can't buy enough plants to fill it up. Now you can't weed everything in between. Now the plants have to be doing some of the work for you. That's kind of what this is about. So if I'm going to if I want this plant to be one of the plants to colonize this room, and I plant one right here, someday, it's going to take a long time. It's going to drop right there, and there'll be some plants, and then it'll drop right next to it, will be some plants. But if I plant one here, and I plant one there, and over there, and over there, and over there, or little colonies of them, now they have the ability to distribute around the landscape more. And I know they're not going to move because they drop by gravity, so I need to distribute them around the landscape. Other plants, the seeds are distributed by wind, such as Philiptrum diocum, meadow root, such as this plant. Now that plant, I don't need to scatter them all over the landscape. The wind will do that for me. However, I also can generally determine the direction of the wind, the prevailing winds, at the time that the seeds are ripe and blowing on this plant. So if I'm really trying to, I can't afford to buy enough plants to do this whole thing, but I want to make it happen as fast as I can. Well, I might want to buy quite a few geraniums because I need to plant them around. But the philiptrum, I could plant a few on the side that the wind is coming from, and I'll end up with seedlings around the landscape. So I don't need to get that many of them. And placement is important. Now birds. This is Viburnum acerifolium. Obviously, burying plants are distributed by birds. They eat them, they defecate. So how can I control a bird and where it's going to go and what it's going to do? Well, to some extent I can. If a bird comes and eats that berry and there's nothing interesting in my landscape to that bird to keep him or her there, then the likelihood is that bird's going to have a little meal and fly away, drop the berry somewhere else. However, if I have water and I have cover and I have as many elements as possible to keep that bird around for a while, there's a higher chance that that bird is going to drop that seed on my property, number one. Number two, this is something I just discovered by accident on my property. There was an area where my dog used to go frequently to go to the bathroom and then come, and it was dirt. And he'd come back in and track into the kitchen. So I put pea gravel there, just so he wouldn't track. And it was, pea gravel is very small, roundish gravel. And next thing I knew, I had tons of cherry trees coming up in that gravel. And what's that about? Cherries like gravel? That doesn't make sense to me. And I talked it over with an ornithologist, and this is about talking things through and then you figure it out. He said, oh yeah. He said birds, they ingest that gravel, they pass it through their system. And so that gravel is actually attracting birds, and they're hanging around there a lot, and they eat a lot of cherries, and so they're defecating. So I can not only have varying fruits by doing gravel patches around my property, but I could theoretically determine where they're going to be to some extent. Not with certainty, not with exactitude. I could actually manipulate this. There's a lot. This is the kind of stuff I'm going to talk about. And there's just a lot of it, much more than I could possibly show you today. Here's golden groundsel, which I showed you before. In the landscape, here it is planted in a wilder landscape. This moves by underground stolons. So again, if I plant them around, they will expand. If I plant them all on one end, it's going to take them a long time to get to the other end. And this is just some of that landscape. There are certain plants, we're back to seed. I should have had this in the first section. There are certain species, such as Penstemon hirsutus, which this plant is, one of the beard tongues, that tend to germinate readily, and the seed is usually carried by running surface water, but they don't germinate in any kind of competition at all. They germinate in very dry, impoverished places where other plants won't grow, such as the crack of rocks. So here is the plants that were placed literally there were a few plants here placed. They're germinating on the top of the rock where there's the thinnest layer of soil, and now they're germinating down through the cracks. And when they get to the bottom, where there's a deeper soil and we've planted other things, they stop because there's too much competition there. So planting 3 plants at the top, I don't remember how many you planted, of that rock can generate thousands of plants over that rock face. And there's other species that do similar things, and columbine is certainly a common one. You planted columbine in the landscape, and it tends to be not very competitive and short-lived. Well, it's one of these kinds of plants. You figure if a plant can grow out of the crack of a rock with virtually no soil and moisture, that must be a very competitive plant, right? No, it's the opposite. It's a very non-competitive plant, and it's evolved the ability to live where other plants can't live and compete with it. And it's found a strategy, which is drought resistance and lack of soil necessity, to avoid the competition. And consequently, these plants are very interesting. Did I show this image next? No, I didn't. But these plants have a very interesting role in the landscape. You plant a few of them, and where do they find places to grow? The places where kind of nothing else grows, and you find them on the edges of the asphalt of the driveway, you find them in the little cracks of the stone wall, you find them between the stepping stones, where if there's gravel is another place they tend to grow. In gravel beds sometimes. These kinds of plants will grow in like pure gravel. So basically they're kind of filling the gaps where other things don't want to be. So there's a kind of lessons you can learn here. This is another plant that expands by underground rhizomes, and this is Pennsylvania sedge, and this is a Pennsylvania sedge lawn in Hastings-on-Hudson, New York, that we planted. And there are certain characteristics that you can generalize about plants that can be helpful to you. And plants that expand by underground rhizomes generally do not produce much or any viable seed. Plants will evolve one strategy for proliferation, and they're going to put all their energy into that, and they're not going to generally have multiple strategies. So this is a great plant for a lawn substitute or a ground cover in the open, dry woodlands. And I would love to be able to buy seed and seed it in the woods and seed it for lawns, except you can't get seed of it. It doesn't produce viable seed because it grows by rhizomes. So you have to buy live plants, small plugs, and plant them out. But there's certain characteristics like that. You say, well, how do I learn which plants have viable seed and which don't? And some of it is learning about individual plants, but some of it is knowing general characteristics and extrapolating that characteristic over a lot of plants. Meaning, it may not sound like much to you today, but if you really were starting to make an effort to learn about this stuff, you learn a rule like that, and it'll tell you about Senecio aureus, golden groundsel, that yellow flower plant, same thing. It looks like it's producing tons of seed. I have it at my house. I never see a seedling, ever. Just, it's not viable, evidently. It's putting its energy into moving out my roots. And there's a lot of kind of rules like that, that once you understand the underlying concept, you'll find use for it all over the place, and you start becoming knowledgeable quicker than you think you would. So other plants move by rhizomes. I always get mixed up between rhizomes and stolons. Rhizomes are underground expanding roots. Stolons are the stems above ground. The plant moves along the surface, and then when it finds a gap in the vegetation, if there is vegetation there, it roots in, and then it moves along the surface and roots in. That's an interesting thing, because when weed suppression, if you're trying to create low maintenance landscape, which is one of the goals that I'm always trying to accomplish, really three things: to try to have environmental benefit to the landscape, to reduce maintenance, and to have a beautiful aesthetic and a beautiful experience using it. And so one of those reduced maintenance, and maintenance, the single item that takes the most maintenance is weeds. There's pretty much no question about that. And the way to suppress weeds is to have vegetation, a vegetative cover, as much as possible over the entire landscape. And that is a goal of ours all the time. Sometimes we plant and we mulch in between, but that's intended to be as temporary as possible. Even if we're not seeding and doing all the things I'm talking about, if we're just planting a native landscape in a traditional manner, I always want a dense intermingled cover on the ground to suppress weeds. And seeds do generally not germinate underneath existing dense vegetation. And they will germinate in the gaps. So once you get that, you get gaps here and there. Not every single spot is the plant thriving. Something disturbed it. You tromp through and disturb the soil with your boots, whatever, and that's where the weed comes up. Disturbed soil, opening, weed. What's a stoloniferous plant doing? It's finding gaps and rooting in and putting out a mess of foliage where at that root. It's kind of automatically finding the gaps for you and filling them in. So by distributing these kinds of plants around, going forward, you have an assistant, so to speak, looking for gaps, plugging them up. And again, this kind of concept, putting together a palette of not only plants that will thrive in your landscape, not only plants that you like aesthetically and want to see, but plants that are going to proliferate and function. And so consequently, with all of these strategies, if I wanted to colonize this room, and let's say I'm in the woods, I could seed it as a meadow if it was sunny. But the woodlands, seeding directly in the woodlands is not really a doable proposition. The vast majority of woodland species, the seeds are not viable long enough. If you buy them and they're collected and stored and sent to you, when you get in the ground, they're not viable. Many woodland species have very specific characteristics of the environment that they're in that they have to have, such as certain mycorrhizal fungi or ants moving them or things happening. So really, live plants is the way to go in the woods. And you can't afford to buy enough plants to fill up this whole room. You plant colonies. And I'll talk a little bit about fostering them and increasing the ability. But one of the characteristics of the plants that you put in these colonies, or in your landscape in general, is to have represented all of these strategies. So you have as many weapons as possible, so to speak, for these plants to be moving around the landscape. So here's a picture of a rain garden on the edge of a pool, and you're seeing Joe Pyeweed and Black-Eyed Susan in there. And this is about the successionary process between different species. There are what I would call disturbance species that germinate quickly, flower quickly, and die early. Their purpose is to colonize quickly a disturbed situation and then give way to slower growing but more longer lived species. And in this case, like Joe Pyeweed might be the plant and panicum, and that's a cultivar of panicum here. So what you're seeing there, I have another picture that's closer up, yeah. So what you're seeing here is a landscape that's planted with long-term species like panicum and Joe Pyeweed and New York ironweed and other things. And instead of mulching in between the plants, it's been seeded with Rudbeckia hirta, which is a biennial. So what's going on here? The biennial germinates very quickly, and in the first year there was an annual grass planted that only lived the first year, but we're in year 2. And that's gone. So the first year, an annual grass grew up and filled the space and suppressed the weeds in between the live plants of the long-term species that were planted and arranged. The second year, we're here now, the annual grass died off because it's an annual, and Black-Eyed Susan is now filling the space between the plants because they're not filled in yet. And then you move forward. Black-Eyed Susan's biennial. Almost 2 years, it dies. And now the long-term species, and you see hardy ageratum and Culver's root and other things in here, have now closed in and closed off the site. So we've actually used a seed mix of short-lived species to replace mulch in the early stages before we have achieved a closed landscape. So why isn't the Black-Eyed Susans flower? They form seed. There's millions of seeds of Black-Eyed Susans in there. I don't see one. Why? Because now there's a vegetative cover. And those seeds are there, but they're not germinating because they do not germinate underneath existing vegetation, which is a general rule. Now, what's going to happen if there's a gap? What's likely to come into the gap? A weed, or in this case, a Black-Eyed Susan, because that gap will allow seed to germinate. So the plant has served 2 roles. It served a role as a filler plant in the interim while your potted perennials have yet to fill in and close it off. And it's serving as an insurance policy down the road for wherever there's a disturbance or a weak point in the landscape, that seed will germinate and be a likely dominating plant for that gap instead of something else that you don't want. No guarantee, but at least in many of the gap situations, that's what will occur. So again, if you go back to the title of this, it's setting a process in motion. You've got stoloniferous plants kind of plugging the holes. You've got seeds coming back where they have the opportunity. You've got stoloniferous plants closing in. You've got plants, there's a lot of things going on here that are in your favor. And why did I put that there? I don't know. Obviously it's this is a butterfly. For those of you who don't know, this is a butterfly. Pollinators, yes, that's right. We attract butterflies to our landscapes often to look at them and enjoy them and, help them out. But they're also pollinators of our plants as well as other insects. And if we want a lot of seed production so that we have a self-perpetuating landscape, we need pollination to occur. And so including pollinators in the landscape, including plants that attract pollinators in the landscape, is not only going to give you nice butterflies and insects to look at, and not only be nice for them, but it's going to help the landscape. So let's talk about cultivars and how that relates to this. And we use cultivars in the landscape frequently, however, not always, not in every situation. So this plant is Physostogia virginiana, or obedience plant, except it's a variety, a cultivar that's white, because the native species is pink. And it's called, I believe, Miss Manners. So why should you use it or not? Well, one reason to not use it is, if I want this plant to colonize the landscape, and as you know, if you came to Doug Tallamy's lecture, insects in particular hone in on the species that they co-evolve with, and they know they're looking for a certain color at a certain time of year and a certain flower structure, and when they get to that flower, there's certain structures that they dovetail with, and so consequently, does the insects that pollinate obedience plant recognize this if it's white and not pink? I don't know the answer, and it may very well be that they would still go to it. However, it may be that they won't. So the idea of using cultivars, particularly, is a cultivar good or bad? Not necessarily either. It depends on what you're trying to do. A differing flower color or a different time of year that it blooms may be fooling the pollinators into not going to that plant and pollinating it. If you like a white Miss Manners, maybe you plant a lot of the pink one and a couple of the white ones because you want them, so you still have plants that are proliferating in the landscape. But now I'm going to contradict myself, and I just thought of this the last time I did use this plant as an example in the lecture, because what I didn't realize is I'm contradicting something that I said before. Physostogia is an underground colonizer by rhizomatous roots. And consequently, it likely does not produce much viable seed. So maybe it doesn't matter, because I'm not looking for flower pollination on this plant anyway. This is something I kind of realized as I was talking about this plant in the lecture. So you're really thinking about, an understanding of the plant. So the fact, you could have figured that out. You don't know necessarily. Specifically, no one maybe ever told you. Nobody ever told me how viable the seed is from Physostogia. I'm extrapolating that because of the underground stems. And when I was putting together this point, when I use it in a lecture, I was thinking, okay, I want a cultivar that's a different flower color so I can show it, and I didn't think it through altogether, and I threw in Miss Manners, Again, underlying understanding generates able to make decisions about things. Planting from seed. I don't want to run over time here, so I won't go extensively as we could talk about planting from seed. But I think we have to rely on seed a lot more than we do, not just for lawns and putting crown vetch on banks, but for establishing landscapes. So here's a lawn converted from seed into meadow. I was just here the other day, and it's really actually looking pretty incredible. There were some live plants inserted, such as that Monarda, but most of it's from seed. And then there are places where you're not going to use seed. These are this is a stone terrace in the rear of a house. These are little beds that were cut out of the stone terrace when we designed it. And they're small, and they're right up against the house. And we're not going to seed and just let things sort themselves out. It would be too wild looking. So here, we're going to use plants that are adapted to this particular habitat. We're going to arrange them in the manner that it's similar to the way they might have occurred with their associates. But we're not going to put seed. We're going to arrange it. We may use cultivars like Husker's Red, Penstemon. So we're not always doing this. Remember the horticulture, the line horticulture, more design, more wild, totally wild. You pick which one. This would be pretty close to horticulture. In fact, I'd call it the straight line of horticulture, maybe, because I'm arranging this garden and I'm pretty much going to keep it as such in that case, even though it's native plants. You turn around and look out into the landscape, and there's 30-some acres of seeded meadows, and then interim gardens that transition. And those interim gardens are the ones, a seeded meadow, obviously you're putting seed out and it's wild. Those little beds on the terrace, I'm arranging them. I want them to look designed. I want them to look like a garden because that's what the client is going to want there. But in the interim, in the middle areas there, around the pool, it's a little bit of both. It's seed, it's live plants, there's arrangement, but things are moving around. We're selecting this, we're selecting that. That's where we kind of get into this kind of stuff that we're talking about here. I just wanted to show this for the idea of competition. This was all Japanese stiltgrass microstegium when we started. And we took efforts to remove it and kill it and planted it with various things. But in the spring you can see golden groundsel again and golden Alexander, Zizia aureus in there. And what I want to show here is we struggled to get rid of the microstegium and we struggled to get this to happen. But once it's there, there are still microstegium, Japanese stiltgrass seeds in there, but they are no longer germinating because we got to the point of dense cover. Now if you, that's an image I used to make another point. But what I'm going to say here is, to finish it, if you see at the back end there, if you go back in the woods, and I have an image which we don't have here, you would see that it's the same conditions, same soil, same everything, and you'll see garlic mustard and Japanese stiltgrass all over the place. And you won't find it here, except maybe an odd plant here or there, which would be very easy, which is very easy to remove. And it's really, you can really believe in this idea of smothering and seed germination. I walked through a meadow today of ours that we took a tour through, and you stand there, and it's really evident when you stand there. I'm standing there, and there's 4 feet of vegetation. How come, almost everything here was part of the seed mix, and it's not like invasive plants? Well, there's a dance in the beginning to get it to that point, but once you're there, I don't care what plant you are. I don't care how aggressive an invasive species. You drop into 4 feet of dense vegetation, or 3 feet, or 2 feet of dense layered vegetation. It's pitch dark down there. If you germinate, you're not going to survive. There's a root mass underneath you. You can't find space. It really is. It's the gaps where things come in. Bottle brush grass, which was planted by seed. The reason that I wanted to show these 2 plants is, I mentioned in the woods, it's very difficult to seed into the woods because there's very few plants. 2 of them that do work. One is the Zizia aureus, or golden Alexander, which is this plant, and one of the other ones is bottle brush grass, which is that one. And there are a couple others, but it's really tough. You really have to plant live plants. Techniques to assist plant proliferation. I can't see the clock. What time am I supposed to wind up here?
Don't worry about it.
Don't worry. Don't say that, man. Don't say that. Techniques to assist plant proliferation. Did you folks bring sleeping bags or anything? Techniques to assist plant proliferation. Active seed dispersal. All right, what do I need to do about this Joe Pye weed if I wanted to move around the landscape? Not a damn thing, because the wind will blow it around and it'll colonize. How about cardinal flower? This is an interesting one. Cardinal flower relates to a couple things that I've been talking about so far. It's one of these short, remember I said black-eyed Susan, short-lived plant, biennial, functions as a quick filler, then goes away and the seeds are there waiting for little openings. Well, cardinal flower is kind of like that too. It's a perennial, but it's a short-lived perennial, so it's in kind of that category. Now this is a little pond that I did in my house, and above it is a bank right behind my house. And when I first planted the landscape, I planted some cardinal flowers, and I planted some plants of all the different strategies that I've been talking about. And as expected, the cardinal flowers bloomed and proliferated in the first couple of years, and then they got outcompeted by everything else, and they disappeared. Okay, I expected that. I know that's what cardinal flower does, and I'm okay with that. However, it's on a slope, and right below the slope, I have other gardens that are a little more diminutive things that I play around with more, and there's more little gaps in there, but I never got any cardinal flower down there. You would think rain comes down the slope and into this lower terrace with these little beds, and I never see a cardinal flower. It was gone for years. So I'm assuming, that it doesn't move. I wasn't really thinking about that much, to tell you the truth. Except one day I get a little cardinal flower showing up in the cracks of this rock here, where there's not competition, not surprisingly. So I thought, oh yeah, a little cardinal flower's back. Let's get it going down below. I'd like to have it back. So I took the seed stalk, and I placed it in a little gap in the garden bed, and I took a rake and disturbed the soil to make it disturbance encourages seed germination. You know, and right by that worm-bean tree, I got a little cardinal flower, so that's cool. However, this is the terrace. You see, there's a terrace off to the right. Here's the terrace. That's all cardinal flower coming in. Now, what's going on here? Because for 6, 7, 8 years, the cardinal flower was gone, and it never washed down the hill and colonized the cracks in my terrace. And then I put one next to the terrace, a seed stalk that resulted in a plant, and now it's traveling all over the place. Okay, what's going on here? Think about it. Do a little research, do a little talking. Cardinal flower, and I knew this, is really tiny seed. It's like dust, you know, like that. And seeds, many floodplain type species, alluvial floodplain species like cardinal flower, are very tiny seed, a lot of the sedges and rushes. And what's going on with that seed is, whatever's going on with it from the size and whatever else, it attaches itself to soil. So when waters are coming through in floods, it's staying where it is, or at least some of it is, staying in place. It's a strategy. It's attaching to soil. So consequently, it was the seeds that were produced when that cardinal flower was happening on the bank were attaching to the soil, but they weren't running down into my terrace. But when I took a plant and put it by the stone, and it's falling on the stone, there's nothing to attach to, and now it's running with water, finding all the cracks and germinating, and resulting in that the next year, and that the next year. And my job now is to just create some paths so I can get to the steps and the bench and move my table out of the way. So, and if you were at my house today, you would see now cardinal flower on the perimeters of the property because I've taken stalks and I've moved them around. Now, there's a path that goes from this terrace around to the front yard. And if you walk that path, there's cardinal flower all along the path, not off the path, because once it gets to the edge of the path, it won't move in the soil. It's attached to soil anymore. So if I wanted cardinal flower bands through my property, I could literally, I don't have to build nice stone paths. I could take scree or whatever and just lay it in a line and plant a plant and expect to show up along that thing and move around. You know, I haven't done that yet in a job or this, but you know, the point is, I haven't seen a cardinal flower for 6, 7 years on my property until that one that I discovered and moved, and now I have thousands of them. But they're not just anywhere. I know what it takes to get them. I either got to move them, or I got to give them some kind of a non-soil conduit to travel in the landscape. Here it is moving down the path. That's the path. So one thing we're now doing on properties is, not all seeds are ripe at the same time. We're planting plants, and some of them, like the geranium maculatum that I showed you in the very beginning, is another one. You can move it around. If it's only going to drop by gravity, you can plant them around the landscape. You can also take seed stalks and move them around the landscape and disturb the soil where you drop the seed stalks to make it happen. So we do a calendar of seed ripening times for those species that are in that landscape that should be actively dispersed. Discouraging seed dispersal, invasive plants. Sometimes you don't have the ability to get rid of them in total in your property. If you can't do that, you want to not let them go to seed. So you're at least affecting the seed bank going forward. Foster the expansion of seed source colonies planted and existing. This is similar to what I talked about with the geranium. So here's a block of land, and it's invasive plant dominated. So this is a strategy to, over time, change the vegetation to desirable species. So I pick a couple zones, let's say here, 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 and I remove the invasive plants and I plant the species that I want. And I plant plants with all the different seed dispersal and root expansion and stem expansion strategies. Then I make sure I manage that and keep, while there's still space between them, maybe I put a seed mix in with it to germinate quickly to suppress weeds, but I make sure that the weeds don't come back, and I manage those little plots until it's closed in and I have an easily managed situation because I have dense cover and there's not much seed germination anymore. Good. Now, I take a zone immediately around it and I also remove the invasive vegetation and I disturb the soil. And I've created the perfect situation for the seeds, the roots, the stems to colonize this as quickly as possible. And I manage it because there'll be some germination of unwanted things. Make sure that in the early stages, when things are starting to germinate and move, that you select for what you want. And then that fills in. When that fills in, you move to the next zone. In the meantime, this is still invasive plants. What am I doing with it? Well, you might just mow it periodically. Why? To keep seeds from being formed, to weaken the plants. You won't be killing them in all likelihood, but every time a plant grows and it gets cut back, it has wasted energy. And when will I mow it? I mow it to make sure it doesn't go to seed, first of all, so it's not distributing more seeds into the landscape, number one. And I mow it at the time that will most weaken it, which is often in late summer, early fall. Why? Because plants photosynthesize during the year, they're making food in the leaves, and later in the season, they're sending that food down the root to the roots for storage for the winter, for next year. If you let it spend all that energy to photosynthesize during the summer and the spring, and then cut it, it can't send it down to the roots, and you've weakened the plant. You haven't let it go to seed. And so as these are expanding, these are getting weaker and easier to eradicate and not coming back as strong as you're moving. Until eventually you get to the point where you feel like you can remove the rest of the invasive plants and just manage the rest of it. How long does it take? It depends on how close the colonies are and what kind of plants. There's no answer to that. But eventually your goal is this over time. And I think one of the things that's going on here that I'm talking about is this idea of planting a landscape in one shot and then it's done and it switches to maintenance. I think that what we need to do, sure, a little garden around the foundation of the house, a little patch by the, you can do that. You can plant, mulch it and weed it if you want. There's no problem there. If we're going to get out into the woods, we're going to get out into the meadows, replace the lawns with things. I think often it's going to be this process over time of conversion from what we have that we're not satisfied with to what we want. And that landscapes are not, okay, I'm in the design stage, I'm in the planting stage, I'm designing 5 years down the road because I'm deciding whether this plant, a Joe Pye weed that comes up, I may want it over here, but I may not want it right in front of my window that's going to block the view to the backyard. So I'm making design decisions of what I'm going to leave, more what I'm going to remove than what. If I grab a stalk 5 years down the road of cardinal flower, that's a design decision where I drop it. And I might just want it to colonize everywhere and throw them all around, or I might want to frame a sculpture that's in the backyard with it and just put it on either side, These are design decisions. So design's not over when you start, when you plant it. And I don't even like the word maintenance, because maintenance applies to a car. You want everything in that engine to be exactly the same as much as possible, so you're maintaining it for sameness. This is different. Management means, things are changing, but I'm influencing that change in certain directions. So this is an example of that. In this case, this wasn't a planted zone. This was going into a landscape, finding the spots where there were desirable species clustered, and then doing the same process. Cleaning them out, doing a disturbance zone around the edge. And in this case, Canada goldenrod, which is a native goldenrod, but way too aggressive for me, and I don't like it, and mostly I consider weed. I plant lots of goldenrods, but not that one. This would then get mowed, while this will expand into that. This hasn't been cleaned out yet. See, there's some blackberry things. There's whitewood aster and Christmas fern and other things in here. Solomon seal, and they were just naturally occurring. So this will get mowed. I think I have another image of it. The interim areas being mowed, period. Maybe a couple times a year. And this is the one of the management zone getting bigger and expanding. Actually, I was here today, earlier today, and these zones are now big. It's been a number of years we've been doing this, and they're noticeably larger. There's one of them, the whitewood aster. Move through quickly now, because I don't want to hold you here too long. Selective cutting and mowing. This is a great strategy, particularly in the woods. Most of the time, if you analyze what's in your woodlands, let's say you've got weeds that you want to get rid of. Blackberry is one on this property I've been looking at that was really throughout the open woodlands. But there was also Canada Mayflower and wild geranium and a number of different fern species and Solomon seal and a a number of things, and they're whitewood aster, but they're all under 24 inches. And the blackberry and the multiflora rose and things that were growing there grow much taller than that. So I determined the maximum height of the desired species, and if my undesirable species are upright and tall, I set a mow height, which could be either weed whacking or mowing with some kind of a brush hog that you can raise depending on where you can get in and out of, and mow it at that height. So I'm never cutting the desirable plants here, never disturbing them, and whenever one of these guys are coming through, they're getting cut off. Does that change the vegetation overnight? No. But if you do that over a period of years, most plants that are upright don't have a lot of leaves down here. So if you and plus this is dense, this starts getting denser. These guys are getting weaker when they get cut back. They're fighting with this is getting denser because you haven't allowed this to overtop it. So you got two things going on. This plant's getting weaker. This plant's getting stronger. And over time, you start getting the composition. And here's an example. This is Canada Mayflower mixed with blackberry. Here's a Canada Mayflower and blackberry. This is after it's been done for a while because the Canada Mayflower is now getting thicker, but the blackberry is still there. You mark trees or shrubs so that they don't get cut with the whole thing, so that they go around, ribbon them, or else show the people what plants they shouldn't be going after. Now this is after a number of years of this strategy. Canada Mayflower, we mowed. Now in this case, particularly if you're using weed whackers, it almost becomes like hedge trimming the woods. In the spring, when the Mayflower is really short, we're cutting it like 3 inches because the stuff is ground hugging. But when you hit a fern patch, you go over the top of it. You hit a geranium patch, you go over it. So the crew is basically weed whipping the woods. In some cases, if you're using a brush hog, you just need one height and it's kind of more gross. But you can get more refined with it, where the weed whackers are actually going over, sculpting around good plants. So they're cutting everything undesirable and never cutting anything desirable. That's what was done here over a period of a number of years. And here we ended up with this huge carpet of Canada Mayflower and these fern patches from this mow strategy. Now, here it is close up. Here's Pennsylvania sedge coming through a little later. So as the next time they come through, maybe it happens once in the spring, once in the summer, and once in the fall, or early fall. Now we've got Pennsylvania sedge, and that's taller than this. So now we're going to raise the weed whackers to go over the top of that. So as the season progresses, sometimes it might go up. This stuff is really powerful. Timed mowing the spring, certain times in spring versus certain times in summer, and I don't have time to go into it, can affect vegetation on a terrific scale between warm season grasses and cool season grasses and other plants. However, the problem with it is, whether you're doing this work yourself, you need to understand the concepts. And if you're bringing in a contractor or hiring someone to do it, they're not going to understand this. They're going to need very intense direction. And I think that a place like this, other educational institutions, if this kind of training started to occur, it could make a big difference. It's our biggest problem, is maintaining these landscapes after we've planted them. Because we keep adding landscapes, but they don't end the day you plant them. So we keep having to keep our heads in the landscapes. There's a lot getting added and nothing getting subtracted because we keep going with them over time. And there's very few people. We've now got contractors that we've trained, so we can kind of deal with this. If you don't, you can't just say, okay, turn it over to the contractor. Now we write up guidelines, we write this stuff up. Those charts that you see are in management specifications that we have, and we try to make them as simple and easy as possible to follow, and they can be. But I think there needs to be a sea change in how people learn to manage the landscape. I'll just quickly go through the last couple things. Soil manipulations. This is a field of little bluestem, and little bluestem doesn't need but can tolerate acid soils. Most of the weeds that we have will not tolerate acid soils or don't grow as well. Not that I will say they won't tolerate, but they don't grow as well in acid soils because of the fertility level. When the pH goes down to a certain point, nutrients become unavailable to plants, or less of them are available to plants. Little bluestem loves infertile, and many of its associates in a dry meadow do fine in infertile situations, but the weeds don't do as well. So if you have a real rich soil, we'll sometimes put sulfur to lower the pH and make it mimic a more infertile soil to reduce the weed presence and and plant plants that can tolerate it. I'm going to kind of whip through some of this stuff, but soil manipulations. This is Euchre villosa. It's like the penstemon in the columbine. It finds cracks and dry places with a little competition and then germinates. Here it is, planted on top of the wall, germinating in between the rocks. I put gravel along the side of my house. It's just a skinny little passageway to get to the back. So I'm trying to make it look good, so I put gravel on the right along the wall, just so it was clean. And the Euchre just followed the gravel. Just followed the gravel. I didn't plant one of them. On the left side, I think the next picture, there was pachysandra there that I inherited, and I decided, and my property line is like right off that. I decided, all right, I'm going to get rid of the pachysandra, so I got rid of it. What should I plant there? I don't need to plant anything. I can just put gravel there, and that stuff's coming up. Except, you know what happened? It is hopping over. I don't have a picture of it now. I just took this maybe 2 years ago. Remember the cardinal flower? It's following the stones. I got the cardinal flower here and Euchre, which I didn't think about when I put the gravel there. I'll end with this, which is my house. And what's going on here, you're seeing hickory and oak trees in the understory. And I say I didn't plant the hickories and oaks, but they wouldn't be there if I didn't do something. Here you can see small sapling trees. Here's a big old hickory. There's an oak to the right. And here's raw wood chips, which you shouldn't do. Never put that down in horticulture. You end up breaking every rule in horticulture when you do this stuff. Well, there was a study at Rutgers where they did different patches of land, did different applications to it, small patches, and then inventoried what plants naturally recruited in them. And when they put raw wood chips down, they found that they got a lot of native trees. And they didn't just get native pioneer trees like birch, they got native late-stage woodland trees like oaks and hickories. Interesting. Maybe the wood chips are mimicking, rotting wood on the floor of the forest, and so those plants were germinating where they wouldn't normally. So I thought, well, what I would like is a woodland grove here, and oak hickory forest is kind of the forest that could easily be there, and I like that. So instead of buying oak and hickory trees, I put wood chips, and guess what? I got oaks and hickories, which I'm not getting elsewhere on the property. Now, again, you got to think it through. Oak and hickories are nut plants. Okay. Oak and hickories are nut plants. The small mammals that move them only go about 30 yards or so. So if you don't have any on your property or nearby, they're not going to move. You're not going to get them no matter how many wood chips you put there. You might get maples or ash because they're wind blown. But I have the seed source. I put the wood chips. I got the trees. And I'm planting strategies, like I said, underneath. But then this oak came down in a storm, half of it. And it ripped up, I never took a picture at the time, but it was setting. But it ripped up this pachysandra bed and generated a whole lot of seed germination. And one of the plants that germinated were sassafras. A couple bittersweet, I got rid of them, and I said, oh, sassafras grove at the base of this would be cool. So I'm going to let sassafras grow, and I'm going to just cut a little window, so I'm walking on the path to my shed that frames the trunk of the old tree, and I've got sassafras grove now. But think about it. A disturbance of the mineral soil brought pioneer species, sassafras. Putting wood chips down brought oaks and hickories. Remember I talked about the pea gravel and I got cherries? Putting pea gravel all on the same property, in the same soil, in the same shade sun conditions. 3 different applications got different plants. I put gravel and I got Euchre following the gravel. I put a seeds and got a plant by my stone terrace, and all of a sudden I got a cardinal flower moving around. There's a lot going on here. I live in less than 1/3 of an acre in inner-ring suburb of Philadelphia. I'm not out in the wilds in a 100-acre estate or anything like that. I'm living in a neighborhood, and there's all this stuff going on. I just want to finish it with a nice picture. So. Back to the cardinal flower. I'll finish it with this. This is cool. This is a property we did. You've seen pictures of it so far. Meadow, and we planted those trees. These are the trees that came from the oaks and hickories. I realized at one point that I planted those trees, heavy caliber, big specimens, the same year that I put down the wood chips at my house. So I went back and looked at them and estimated how big they were. These are like 50% taller, meaning they started from an acorn or a hickory nut the year I planted a big caliper tree. Now let's think about this, and I promise I'm going to end it here. This is the last thing I'm going to say. And there's my cauliflower that I took stalks and moved around. You want to buy an oak tree? You go to a landscape contractor to get you an oak tree, and maybe in Tennessee, where there's a ton of nurseries that supply plants all over the East Coast. Some nursery in Tennessee took a big tree spade and dug the tree, loaded it up on a truck. That truck drove through Tennessee red oak forests, drove through West Virginia red oak forests, drove through Virginia red oak forests, and Maryland red oak forests, and Pennsylvania red oak forests to get to Philadelphia. Then it unloaded it in a wholesale yard, and it sat in that wholesale yard, and towers were watering and throwing water all over the place. 10% of it was going over the plants, and the rest is going off in the stormwater system. And then a truck came to that wholesale yard, and a machine came and loaded the truck with the tree, and then the truck drove an hour or so to your house. And then another machine unloaded it and drove it to the backyard, and some people in the machine dug a big hole and planted the tree. And you got an oak tree. And in my yard, a squirrel scampered 30 yards and planted an acorn. I got a tree that's 50% bigger. So am I saying that we don't plant anything anymore? I've got a blueberry patch. I wasn't going to just hope that blueberries showed up. I'm going to plant them. However, we can incorporate a lot more of natural recruitment than we do. And when we start doing that and start manipulating landscapes with a little more foresight and understanding, I think a lot of the things that we have been hoping to accomplish with native plants will actually start happening. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
How did you eliminate the Japanese stiltgrass?
Japanese stiltgrass is an annual, so the plant's dying over the winter. A lot of people make a mistake of, they go out in the fall or something and they weed it all. It's already going to seed. The plants you weeded are going to die over the winter anyway, and you've created massive disturbance, which creates better conditions for seed germination. So the way to control Japanese stiltgrass is to cut it, usually more than once in a season, and not let it go to seed. If you're doing it long-term, slow, never let it go to seed. Next year, seeds germinate and none more get deposited. Next year, seeds germinate and none more get deposited. They're not blown by wind, so they're not moving in mass and exhaust the seed bank. And when you get to the point where you feel it's exhausted enough, then you can go in and plant. The guy we use for, there's a bulletproof way to do this, and we don't do it because I don't like using the chemicals. We use some chemicals, but I draw the line on certain things. And he says, and it's true, if you put down a pre-emergent herbicide, it's only coming back next year from seed. And if you want to plant, you can plant live plants. You can't put seed down because they won't germinate with the pre-emergent herbicide, but you can do that. It's a very effective way to do it. We don't do it. I don't like pre-emergents. They last too long in the landscape environmentally. It's not so good. Yes?
Yes, we just installed a rain garden with a grant. I work for a watershed protection group. And we hired a landscape architect to install, and it's mostly bushes, and we get echinacea. But we now have a ton of weeds. And he put down a lot of wildflower seed. And now I don't know, what to weed and what to do, and I want it to look like your rain garden with grasses and all these wonderful things. But it's just gone in like a month and a half ago. And I'm not quite sure what to do now.
Well, I mean, it depends on what was planted in the seed mix. And, is it a good mix that's actually going to do what it was intended to?
Supposedly.
I would have to really see what it was. What was there, what weeds are there, what good plants have germinated. One thing.
But there's obvious weeds and grasses growing around these bushes. Do we weed those, or do we put mulch, or what do we do?
Well, if they are annual or biennial plants, which weeds that come in mass are usually short-lived species, you maybe just weed whack it. Weed whack around the live plants to keep them from going to seed and to let the long-term seeds come in. But if they are pernicious weeds like mugwort or something, then you got to take more drastic action, to get rid of it. So to answer your question, I can't really, because that this is all about the specific plants and what their characteristics and proclivities are, and responding to that. It's never about just here's step 1, 2, 3 for every situation. There's a great quote by Jean Marie Hartman. She's the woman that did the Rutgers experiment with the wood chips, and she lectured at a conference I run, and she said, there's one answer to any question you can ask about establishing native landscapes or ecological restoration. And I'm thinking, are you serious, man? This is complicated. You think it through, you only need one answer to one question, and the one answer is, it depends.
Follow-up question.
Yes.
Your rain garden, you said that the ground cover overwhelmed the Rudbeckia. If you had created weeded gaps and actually weeded there or whacked it, would the Rudbeckia then come up in those little gaps areas?
Yeah, I mean, wherever you have, the Rudbeckia spreads seed around, and if there's open soil, exposed soil, or non-competitive vegetation there, those seeds will germinate. However, my goal is to get it closed off as soon as I can, because not only are the Rudbeckia going to germinate, but there's a lot of weed seeds. One thing that I didn't mention is kind of really one of the end products and an encouraging one of this whole thing. My property and other places where we've been working for 10, 15 years, 8, 10, 15 years, a major change is occurring for the positive that I don't think people think about. When you first start gardening, the seed bank, the seeds that are in the soil, are dominated by undesirable plants because that's what's around much more than the native species and distributing seeds. However, if you spend 10 years holding back, not letting them go to seed or removing the undesirable species and encouraging the desirable species, like at my house for 20 years now, native species have been distributing seeds for 20 years and undesirable species have not, because I've either pulled them or put a little herbicide on them or cut them. And so consequently, the seed bank at my house now is dominated by native plants that I have encouraged. And consequently, when something new germinates, it's usually something I like. And I see this all over the place where I've worked for a longer period of time. So that's very encouraging because you think about, oh my God, these invasive plants, how the heck? And yeah, it's a lot of work when they are heavily colonized in the beginning and you got to deal with them. But there is an end point. But it's about keeping going, and basically it's the hardest in the beginning, and it gets easier and easier as it goes along, until you basically hit what an ecologist would call a healthy landscape, which has relative stability. That doesn't mean it doesn't change. It means it doesn't veer all over the place. Disturbance creates veering all over the place. It takes it all the way back, new seeds, new things. Now they're fighting it out again instead of, all right, I'm finding our place, we're getting kind of stable. And yes, it changes, and yes, it moves, but it doesn't do this, that, and the other. When you plant and weed in between, you're creating forever disturbing landscape, and you're creating this ecological instability, which is volatile. And volatility means lots of new plants coming in. However, so disturbance is bad. Close it off. But disturbance is worse in the beginning if the seed bank is dominated by undesirable species than it is 10 years down the road when the seed bank is dominated by desirable species. And in fact, the healthy landscape has small moving disturbances because you don't want plants to get old and old and old and nothing young replacing them, just like the sapling trees in the woods are very necessary. It's true in herbaceous and other landscapes too. So once you've reached a healthy ecosystem where the species that you consider desirable or dominating the seed bank, you can even create disturbances here and there selectively to keep things moving along. And I'm kind of at that stage at my property now.
Thank you.
Yes, Kathleen?
You keep teasing us with this idea that there's some way to battle mugwort. What do you do?
Well, actually, a couple things. One, and one of the big elephants in the room here is the H word, herbicide. And we use it very selectively, and we like not to use it sometimes, but it's part of our toolbox.
What herbs?
Stinger. Kills mugwort. Yeah, stinger. The active ingredient, there's a couple of names, a couple of brand names. I can never pronounce it. It's like triplicor. Somebody here probably knows it. Pardon me?
Triclopyr?
Yes, triclopyr. Kills only 3, this is a very useful material, and from a practical standpoint, it only kills 3 families of plants, Asteraceae, Leguminaceae, and Polygonaceae. And it's very effective on those species, and it's very effective on mugwort and Canada thistle and crown vetch, which is in the Leguminaceae family, and it doesn't kill other things. And Here's where design and management gets all mixed up. If we are going to use an herbicide on a project, and sometimes we are and sometimes we're not, but if it's acceptable in a particular project and I've got a mugwort problem, first I'm going to try to kill it as much as I can before I start, clearly. But if sometimes it's bad, you can expect it to reemerge from rootlets, whatever. So I might design a landscape that has none of the 3 species in the initial planting that are affected by that herbicide. Which means if I got a mugwort coming in through a penstemon, what do I do with it? I can't pull mugwort, the roots are too, but I could spray it right on the penstemon, and I won't hurt the penstemon, but I'll kill the mugwort. Now, once the mugwort is under control, I can come back and add in all the asters and the baptisia legume plants and everything else. So that's designing around using a particular material. Now, I've heard it discussed recently, and haven't tried it, that frequent mowing of mugwort, and I forget over the period of time they did it, killed it. But I haven't tried it. And I would think if it worked, it would be very frequent and over a long period of time. That said, we're working on a property now where we're doing a series of organic meadows, and we have test plots set out for mugwort. There's a lot of mugwort on the property, and we're trying multiple strategies from grinding to sulfur and grinding to this, that, and the other, and see what we can do to try to control it. We planted a meadow already where the mugwort isn't, and there's other fields that we're not going to plant until we get something going, so we can't spray it. Thank you. We can take one more question. And who will it be? Yes.
Thank you very much. It was a great lecture.
You're very welcome.
If you're going to plant an area that's already a lawn, would you approach it with planting like 3 places and then managing those areas, or would you remove the lawn and then plant?
Well, it depends on, kind of what your abilities are to do. But, I mean, first of all, if you're going to plant seeds, you need to remove the turf. Either kill it or remove it. The seeds won't germinate in lawn. So you can do patches within it, or you can do the whole thing. But you need to either spray the lawn and kill it and then plant, or else scrape the sod off, which you can do with a sod scraper over pretty big areas, or smother it with plastic, and we've done that. We've done all of the above, basically, and then plant. Thank you very much, folks.